When Marcus Steele found the cruise ship wedged between cliffs where no vessel that size should ever reach, he knew something had gone wrong in ways the living couldn't fully explain. When he found the dog tag bearing his old call sign, he understood it wasn't discovery but invitation. And when Reaper, the 7-year-old German shepherd who'd saved his life 3 times in 2 countries, refused to let him approach alone, Marcus finally grasped the truth. This wasn't about a missing hiker. This was about debts that don't die with the people who owe them. In 48 hours, Marcus would stand over a body executed military style. He would hear the voice of a friend dead 8 years recorded in the moments before bullets found him. He would face the man who'd commanded his unit and discover betrayal wears the uniform you once trusted. But first he'd need to understand how a 5,000-ton relic could appear in water too shallow and channels too narrow for anything larger than a fishing boat. The Northern Star shouldn't exist where it did. But neither should the recording device. Marcus now held his hands trembling in a way they hadn't since Kandahar, as David Cross's voice crackled through decades of rust and silence. "Falcon, don't blame yourself. Shadow and I chose this path. Live. Just live." The gunshot that ended the transmission felt like it happened in the room. Marcus's knees hit the deck water, soaking through his jeans, cold October wind cutting across Lake Superior's surface 60 feet below. Reaper stood between him and the shadows gathering at the bridge stairs. Her body taut as bridge cable ears forward, a growl building in her chest that he felt more than heard. Jack Brennan's voice burst through the radio clipped to Marcus's belt. "We've got movement topside. Multiple contacts approaching from the north tunnel." Marcus's hand found his Glock 19 almost by instinct, checking the magazine more from muscle memory than conscious thought. 15 rounds. Enough if they came in small numbers. Insufficient if they understood what they were walking into. But the recording changed everything. David's last words, preserved in digital amber, held answers Marcus had spent 8 years trying to forget instead of find. If he died on this rusted monument to shipping routes abandoned and secrets buried, at least he'd die knowing the truth mattered more than survival. He pressed his palm against Reaper's shoulder, feeling the controlled power coiled beneath her black and tan coat. "Stay close, girl. Like the old days." She shifted her weight, settling into position at his left side, exactly where she'd been in a dozen firefights across 2 deployments. "Ready." The wind carried the sound of boots on metal, multiple pairs moving with the confidence of men who knew this ship's geography better than the people who'd built it. But to understand how Marcus Steele arrived at this moment holding a gun and a ghost's final words, while a dog bred for war prepared to defend him one more time, you'd need to go back 72 hours. Back to when it started with a phone call about a man who'd gone hiking and never returned. Back to a cabin in the Minnesota woods where a 43-year-old veteran had convinced himself he'd finally escaped the war. He was wrong. Marcus woke at 5:30 because his body no longer remembered how to sleep past sunrise. The cabin's interior held the gray light of pre-dawn October temperature inside, matching the 40 degrees outside, because he didn't believe in wasting propane on comfort. Reaper lay in her usual spot 3 feet from the bed, close enough to wake him if the nightmares got bad, but far enough to respect the boundary between partner and pet. Her eyes opened before he sat up, tracking his movement from mattress to floor. No tail wag, no excited greeting, just professional acknowledgement that another day required their attention. The running route hadn't changed in 6 years. 5 miles through Forest Service roads, long enough to burn the restless energy that came from too little sleep and too many memories. Reaper ranged ahead and behind nose, working the morning air, sorting threats from background with the efficiency that had made her invaluable in Helmand Province. Marcus's breath fogged in the cold air, lungs pulling deep as his pace settled into the rhythm that felt like meditation for men who'd never learned to sit still. His body still carried the build of someone who'd spent 20 years preparing for violence, shoulders, broad core, tight legs that could cover rough terrain for hours without complaint. 43 wasn't old if you'd taken care of yourself. It just meant you'd survived long enough to count the people who hadn't. The cabin appeared through the trees as the sun finally crested the ridge, throwing long shadows across the clearing. No neighbors within 3 miles. No television because the voices became noise after a while, just the radio that picked up the Duluth country station and local news enough to remind him the world continued without requiring his participation. Coffee came from a percolator older than his military service, strong enough that the VA doctors would have lectured him about blood pressure if he'd bothered attending appointments. The bacon went into the cast-iron skillet while eggs waited their turn, the morning routine requiring no thought, just motion. Reaper ate from her bowl with the same methodical focus she applied to everything 45 seconds from first bite to last. Then she sat by the door waiting, because Saturdays meant Sarah Donovan would arrive around 8 with vegetables she claimed came from her garden but always seemed to match what Marcus needed and never asked for. He didn't talk about the nights when sleep refused to come. Didn't mention how sometimes the sound of rain on the metal roof became mortar fire, or how certain smells could transport him back to rooms where friends had died while he'd lived. Didn't explain that Reaper wasn't just a dog, but the only reason his Glock stayed in the safe instead of within reach during the hours when darkness made lies sound like truth. The photograph on the wall caught his attention as it did most mornings. SEAL Team 7 taken outside Kandahar in 2016. 12 men who'd trusted each other with secrets heavier than the gear they carried. David Cross stood third from the left, grinning like someone who'd just heard the best joke of his life and couldn't wait to share it. Danny Donovan beside him, Sarah's older brother, the kind of radio man who could maintain comms through a sandstorm. Victor Grayson at the center, their commanding officer, the man who'd written recommendations that helped Marcus transition to civilian life without the bureaucratic nightmares that buried so many veterans. 6 of those faces belonged to men who'd never made it home. Marcus survived because he'd been standing in the doorway when the building collapsed, positioned to shield others while the ceiling came down. Survivor's guilt didn't scream. It whispered in the hours before dawn, asking why his luck held when better men's hadn't. Reaper's head lifted, ears swiveling toward the dirt road 300 yards out. Vehicle approaching, probably Sarah's Ranger truck based on the engine's pitch. Marcus checked the clock. 7:15. Earlier than usual, and Sarah didn't do early unless something needed attention now rather than later. He opened the door before she knocked. Sarah Donovan, at 38, carried herself with the efficient competence of someone who'd spent a decade managing public lands and the people who underestimated wilderness. Brown hair pulled back, practical jacket showing the superior National Forest patch eyes that missed very little and forgot even less. Her expression held the controlled tension of someone carrying bad news but refusing to let it show in her posture. "Marcus, I need help. Someone's missing." He'd already moved to pour her coffee, the mug appearing in her hand before she finished the sentence. "Call, search and rescue." Did. 2 days, no results. Thomas Erickson, 54, investigative journalist. Went hiking near Emerald Cut. Trucks still at the trailhead, but no sign of him past the first mile marker. Marcus's hand paused halfway to setting down the pot. Emerald Cut. The words carried weight beyond geography history, beyond the official story of a scenic overlook where tourists took photographs. If you knew where to look, you could see the Northern Star from the observation point, that impossible vessel trapped between stone walls, like evidence someone had tried to hide and failed. Why would a journalist hike alone in restricted areas? That's what I'm asking. Sarah's fingers wrapped around the mug, but she didn't drink. Jack Brennan says if anyone can track him, it's you and Reaper. The dog's name brought her attention to the conversation, head tilting in that way she had when processing information that might require action. Marcus studied Sarah's face, reading the details she wasn't verbalizing. A journalist goes missing near a ship that shouldn't exist in terrain most locals avoided carrying gear that suggested more than casual photography. He glanced at the photograph on the wall again, at the faces that wouldn't age any further, and made a decision he'd regret for reasons he couldn't yet imagine. "I'll come." Sarah's shoulders dropped an inch, relief brief before professional focus reasserted itself. The ranger station at 9. Marcus nodded, already calculating what he'd need to bring. Reaper stood, recognizing the shift in his posture that meant work rather than routine. When he moved to the bedroom to change, she followed, positioning herself where she could monitor both the door and his movements. The gear bag came from the closet, contents unchanged since his last tracking job 3 months prior. First aid kit, extra water emergency beacon, the tools of someone who'd learned to prepare for situations that deteriorated faster than planning could accommodate. His hands moved through the checklist automatically while his mind worked the problem Sarah had presented. Journalists didn't hike alone unless they were meeting someone or investigating something worth the risk. Emerald Cut's restricted status came from unstable cliffs, not federal secrets, but the Northern Star's presence complicated simple explanations. That ship represented questions no one in authority seemed interested in answering, including how 5,000 tons of steel had navigated channels that would ground a yacht. The backup equipment bag sat in the corner canvas, worn soft from decades of use, the kind of surplus gear that outlasted the conflicts it had served. Marcus opened it to verify Reaper's emergency supplies, noting the spare collar he'd never used, leather cracked from age and storage. He lifted it to check the condition, noticing for the first time the faded marker notation on the inside, S07. Supply designation probably from whatever depot had issued it. He set it aside and grabbed the newer collar, the one with reflective stitching that would make Reaper visible in low light. She tolerated the check of her harness and gear with patient stillness, understanding the ritual meant deployment rather than training. Sarah had left to prepare at the station, giving Marcus an hour to ready himself for whatever tracking mission awaited. He checked the photograph one more time before heading out, his gaze lingering on Victor Grayson's face. The man had risen through ranks after the team disbanded, making admiral before retiring to private sector maritime security. Marcus hadn't spoken to him in 4 years, not since the last reunion, where too many chairs sat empty and conversations kept circling back to people who'd never fill them again. Reaper waited by the truck, alert, but calm, the demeanor of someone who'd done this enough times to recognize preparation from panic. Marcus opened the rear door, and she jumped in, settling immediately, conserving energy for when it would matter. The drive to the ranger station took 20 minutes through forest that remembered when glaciers had carved these valleys, old-growth pine giving way to birch and aspen as the road climbed toward the ridgeline. Marcus kept the radio off, preferring silence to distraction, his mind already building operational frameworks from insufficient data. The ranger station occupied a clearing with sight lines in 3 directions, a modest building that served as headquarters for managing 200 square miles of public land. Jack Brennan's sheriff's deputy vehicle sat in the lot beside Sarah's truck, the man himself leaning against the hood, coffee in hand, posture suggesting he'd been waiting a while. Jack had the build of someone who'd stayed in shape past 50 through discipline rather than vanity. Gray beard, trimmed, close eyes that had seen enough of human nature to rarely be surprised by it. Former Marine Gulf War veteran, the kind of law enforcement officer who preferred solving problems to making arrests. His attention went to Reaper first, recognition immediate. That your partner from downrange. Marcus closed the truck door, already scanning the area from habit. Best one I ever had. Jack's nod carried understanding that needed no elaboration. They got me out of a few tight spots over there. Loyal as they come. Sarah emerged from the station carrying a folder, her movements efficient as always. The briefing was concise, professional, organized the way someone presented information when they'd practiced the delivery. Thomas Erickson, investigative journalist, formerly with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, recently freelance. Last known project involved weapons trafficking along the Canadian border, specifically routes using Lake Superior shipping channels. She spread photographs across the hood of her truck. Erickson's vehicle, a 2018 Ford F-150, locked keys inside, which immediately raised flags Marcus didn't need to vocalize. The man himself, weathered face of someone who'd spent time in places people didn't advertise, visiting eyes holding the particular wariness that came from asking questions powerful people didn't want answered. The final photograph showed Erickson at his laptop, casual shot that looked pulled from social media. Marcus's gaze caught on a detail most people would miss: the sticker partially visible on the computer's lid, a logo consisting of 4 points radiating from a central star. Company logo, maybe? Sarah's tone suggested she'd noticed the same detail but hadn't found meaning in it yet. Jack cleared his throat, shifting weight in a way that preceded uncomfortable information. One more thing. found this near his truck. He produced an evidence bag containing a strip of paracord military grade cut cleanly rather than frayed. Somebody knew what they were doing with a blade. Marcus accepted the bag, examining the cord through plastic. The cut was precise, angled, the work of someone who'd severed restraints before, not camping gear that had worn through. Someone had been tied and then released or freed themselves with help. Reaper pressed against his leg, her version of asking whether this qualified as their problem now. He rested his hand briefly on her head, acknowledgement and answer both. Sarah folded the folder, her expression shifting to something more personal. "I know this is outside what you normally do, but Jack's right. If anyone can find Erickson, it's you two." The drive to Emerald Cut took 40 minutes along roads that narrowed as they climbed pavement, giving way to gravel forest, pressing close enough that branches scraped the truck's sides. Marcus parked at the observation point, a cleared area where tourists could safely photograph the lake without approaching unstable cliff edges. Reaper was out before he'd killed the engine nose, already working the morning air, sorting information into categories only she could define. Marcus gathered the gear he'd need for a day's search while Jack and Sarah caught up in Sarah's vehicle, giving them privacy to discuss details the official briefing had omitted. Lake Superior spread below them like hammered steel, the water's color shifting from turquoise near shore to deep slate where depth swallowed light. The shoreline twisted through granite formations that had resisted 10,000 years of erosion, creating the kind of landscape photographers loved and sailors feared. And there, wedged into Emerald Cut, like a bone caught in a throat, sat the Northern Star. Even from half a mile distant, the ship dominated the landscape, rust-red hull rising from water that shouldn't have allowed passage for anything larger than a kayak. The vessel tilted 15 degrees to starboard, upper decks partially collapsed, windows dark and empty as abandoned eyes. Vegetation had begun reclaiming metal moss and small trees growing from accumulated soil in sheltered corners. The question everyone asked, the one that never got satisfactory answers: how did it arrive? The cut measured 150 feet at its widest point, 70 where the cliffs pinched closest. The Northern Star's beam exceeded 200 feet. Simple geometry said impossible. Yet there it rested, defying explanation the way certain truths did when people wanted them buried. Marcus pulled Thomas Erickson's jacket from the evidence bag, a worn canvas field coat that smelled of coffee and old books, and the particular musk of someone who'd spent time in places without regular showers. He held it to Reaper's nose, watching her process the scent with the concentration that had found 23 IEDs across 2 deployments. Her head came up after 5 seconds, ears forward, body tensing in the way that preceded movement. But instead of heading toward the established hiking trail, she turned toward the waterline, toward the cut, toward the ship. Sarah frowned, stepping closer. "That doesn't make sense. Hikers don't approach the ship. Too dangerous." Marcus watched Reaper's body language, reading signals he'd learned to trust above radar and satellite imagery. Scent doesn't lie. It just tells the last honest story it knows. Reaper moved forward at a controlled pace, not the excited rush of a dog chasing prey, but the methodical advance of someone tracking with purpose. She'd pause every 20 feet, recalibrate, adjust her vector. Marcus followed Boots, finding purchase on rocks still wet from morning dew. His focus split between watching her and scanning terrain for threats that might not announce themselves. The first discovery came 100 feet from the observation point, tucked beneath an outcropping where casual hikers wouldn't notice. Reaper sat the alert signal she'd been trained to use when finding explosive devices, now repurposed for evidence that mattered. Marcus knelt beside her, examining the paracord fragment without touching it immediately. 18 inches of military-spec cord, the same type Jack had found near Erickson's truck, cut with the same clean precision. But this piece showed additional wear friction marks consistent with restraints that had held weight for extended periods. Someone had been bound here recently enough that the cord hadn't yet absorbed the moisture that would have darkened its fibers. Jack photographed the find while Sarah marked the GPS coordinates. Marcus let Reaper continue her search, trusting her nose more than his eyes. She led them closer to the water's edge where waves had deposited debris among the rocks, the kind of flotsam that accumulated anywhere water met stone. The industrial tape caught light differently than organic material's silver-gray surface reflecting morning sun. Reaper indicated it with the same sitting alert patient while Marcus examined what she'd found. The tape was 2 inches wide, heavy-duty adhesive backing the kind used in shipping containers and industrial packaging. But what made his chest tighten was the logo printed along one edge, faded but unmistakable, 4 points radiating from a central star. The same symbol he'd seen on Erickson's laptop 30 minutes ago. Jack crouched beside him, pulling out his phone to photograph the find. That's not fishing gear. Industrial shipping tape. Marcus's voice came out flat, processing implications faster than he wanted to vocalize. Used to seal containers. Heavy cargo. Sarah's expression shifted, professional concern giving way to something harder to define. You're thinking smuggling. The pieces fit too well to dismiss. Journalist investigating weapons trafficking. Industrial shipping materials. A ship that shouldn't exist in a location that made no tactical sense unless someone needed a way station for cargo that couldn't go through official channels. The Northern Star wasn't a relic. It was infrastructure. Reaper didn't move toward the ship immediately. She held position 30 feet from the rusted hull, body tense, but not advancing, the behavior Marcus recognized from a dozen close calls when her instincts had overruled mission parameters and saved lives. Her ears swiveled, tracking sounds humans couldn't isolate from the ambient noise of wind and water. Then she did something that made the hair on his neck rise. She turned her head to look directly at him, holding eye contact for 3 seconds, and whined softly. Not fear. Warning. The sound she'd made in Kandahar 40 seconds before the mortar rounds started falling. Marcus's hand went to his sidearm before conscious thought engaged old training asserting itself. But the threat wasn't immediate violence. It was suspended above them, swaying slightly in the breeze, visible now that Reaper had directed his attention to the right angle. A dog-tag military issue hung from the Northern Star's rail like bait on a hook. The distance made reading impossible, but the shape was unmistakable, that distinctive rectangular metal that had identified American service members for over a century. Someone had placed it there deliberately at a height that required approach to examine, in a position that would be visible to anyone searching the area. Sarah started forward, but Marcus caught her arm, his grip gentle but firm. Don't. Not yet. Why not? Reaper's warning. She's telling us it's a lure. Jack had his hand on his sidearm now, too, scanning the cliffs and ship's deck with the automatic sweep of someone who'd operated in hostile territory. You think someone's watching? Marcus studied the tag, the way it caught light, how precisely it had been positioned for maximum visibility. The odds of a military dog tag appearing here now during their search for a missing journalist investigating weapons trafficking approached 0, unless someone had staged it. And staging meant audience, meant someone wanted them to see and respond predictably. But even from 30 feet, even knowing it was likely a trap, Marcus could make out the letters stamped into the metal. His vision wasn't what it had been at 25, but certain things you didn't forget how to read. The first line, visible when the tag rotated in the breeze, showed a single word that stopped his breath. Falcon, his call sign. The name only 11 people had known, 6 of them dead. The survivors scattered across 3 continents, living lives that didn't include conversations about shared history. No one should have known that name, certainly not well enough to manufacture a fake tag and position it here now today. Reaper pressed hard against his leg, her full weight leaning into contact the way she'd learned to ground him when panic attacks started. Her presence pulled him back from the edge of memories that wanted to swallow him whole, back to the immediate problem of standing in front of a ship that shouldn't exist, looking at a tag bearing a name that should have been buried with the operations it came from. The metal wasn't right. Even from this distance, Marcus could see the edges were too sharp, the stamping too clean. Military tags showed where accumulated the small damages of daily carry. This one looked fresh, manufactured, recently aged, just enough to pass casual inspection but not close examination. Someone had made this specifically for him. Someone who knew his call sign, knew he'd be here, knew Reaper would stop him from approaching rashly. The level of intelligence that required the operational planning suggested resources far beyond a missing journalist or random smuggling operation. Jack's voice came through, carefully controlled. Steele. You know whose tag that is? Mine. Marcus kept his eyes on the ship, watching for movement for any indication they were under direct observation. Or someone who wants me to think it is. But she chose you anyway. The realization settled in his chest with the weight of truth he couldn't deny. Whatever they planned, loyalty ran deeper than conditioning. Some bonds couldn't be broken by training or time or distance. Sarah stepped back, her hand moving to her radio before she caught herself. Should we call this in? The sound came before anyone could answer, a sharp metallic clack from deep inside the Northern Star's hull. Not the groan of settling metal or the creak of rusting joints. This was precise, deliberate, the sound of a door or hatch being moved by human hands. It echoed across the water, bounced off cliff walls, arrived at their position from multiple directions at once. Reaper's growl started low in her chest. A vibration Marcus felt through his leg before it became audible. Her ears pinned back slightly, not full aggression, but the prelude to it, the warning she gave when threats materialized from uncertainty. Everyone froze. Marcus's hand stayed on his weapon thumb, on the safety finger indexed along the frame. Jack had drawn his sidearm, holding it low and ready. Sarah had her radio out now, finger hovering over the transmit button. The sound didn't repeat. Silence flooded back in, broken only by waves against stone and wind through the cut. But something had changed, some quality of the air or the space, the indefinable difference between empty places and ones that held hidden observers. Jack's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Someone's in there. Or just left. Marcus's tactical mind, the part that had kept him alive through 20 years of situations designed to kill him, began running scenarios. If someone was inside, they'd chosen to announce their presence rather than remain hidden. That suggested confidence, superior position, or both. If they'd left, the timing meant they'd observed Marcus's arrival and decided now was the moment to vacate. Either way, this wasn't random. This was choreographed. We need to move. Marcus made the decision without consulting the others' authority from old chains of command reasserting itself. Jack, hold this position. Sarah, get on the radio, tell them we've got possible activity at the Northern Star. Don't mention the tag or the journalist yet. Sarah started to object, but Jack nodded, understanding the implicit logic. We're walking into something bigger than a search and rescue. Marcus didn't answer because the truth was obvious. He moved toward the ship, Reaper at his side, each step measured and deliberate. The rusted hull rose above them, now blocking the sun, casting shadows that held too many blind spots to clear without a full team. But that tag was bait he needed to examine, even knowing the hook was barbed. Reaper stayed close. Her body language shifted fully into working mode. The partnership they'd developed over years of operations where communication happened through touch and posture rather than words. Her head stayed level with his knee-nose, working constantly, filtering information he couldn't access but needed to trust. The tag rotated slowly on its chain metal, catching light, revealing more details as they approached. The stamping was too deep, the font slightly wrong, small tells that confirmed it was manufactured rather than issued. But the effort spoke to resources and knowledge, someone who'd had access to Marcus's service records or people who'd served with him. Reaper stopped 10 feet from the hull, refusing to advance further. Marcus honored her judgment, crouching to her level, following her sight line. She wasn't looking at the tag anymore. Her focus had shifted to something beneath the ship, where the hull met water, where shadow pooled thick enough to hide anything smaller than a boat. The water's surface showed a disturbance, subtle but present, a straight line cutting through the natural ripple pattern, not wind-driven, not current. Something had passed through recently, maybe minutes ago, leaving a wake that hadn't fully dissipated. The line pointed away from the ship toward deeper water, toward the open lake. Electric motor. Jack had moved up to join them, his voice tight with the realization. No wake, no noise. They could run right along the cliff face, and we'd never hear them over the wind. Marcus stood processing the implications. Someone had been on or near the ship when they arrived. The clack sound had been a signal or a distraction or both. While they'd focused on the tag, whoever was here had slipped away, using the cliffs and water as cover equipment, sophisticated enough to leave minimal trace. Professional. Marcus said it partly to himself, partly to the others. Military or former military. This isn't amateur hour. The tag swayed in the breeze, catching light, mocking them with its precision and its lies. Marcus stepped forward, reached up and pulled it free from the chain. The metal was cold in his palm, stamped letters crisp under his thumb. Falcon. Steel M. His old blood type. His old unit. Everything right except the weight, the wear, the truth of it. He turned it over, scratched into the back with something sharp letters, crude but legible. Come alone. Sarah's breath caught when he showed her. Marcus, this is a threat, or an invitation. Jack's hand stayed on his weapon. Question is, from who? Marcus pocketed the tag, his mind already calculating next moves, threat assessments, the logical progressions that kept you alive when someone was playing games with your life. Whoever staged this knew his call sign, knew he'd respond to a missing person call in this area, knew enough about Reaper to predict she'd stop him from approaching rashly. That level of intelligence suggested surveillance, inside information, or both. The list of people with access to that information was short. Most of them were dead. The others had scattered to lives that didn't include looking backward, which left possibilities Marcus didn't want to examine too closely, implications about trust and betrayal that he'd spent years trying to forget. Reaper pressed against his leg again, grounding him, pulling him back to the present. Her eyes held that particular intensity she showed when she was trying to communicate something beyond her ability to verbalize. Marcus knelt, meeting her at eye level, one hand on her shoulder. "What are you trying to tell me, girl?" She looked toward the ship, then back to him, then toward the water where the wake line had been. Her body language said danger, said hidden threats, said this wasn't finished. Marcus trusted that assessment more than any intelligence briefing he'd ever received. Sarah's radio crackled dispatch responding to her earlier call. They were sending a boat to circle the area, logging the activity, asking if they needed additional personnel. Standard procedure, professional response completely inadequate for what was actually happening. Jack was photographing everything, documenting the scene with methodical precision. His voice stayed level, but Marcus caught the tension underneath. This journalist Erickson, you think he found something worth killing over? The tape with the 4-star logo, the industrial materials, the ship that shouldn't be here, the journalist investigating weapons trafficking. The connections were too tight to be coincidence, too organized to be opportunistic. Whatever Thomas Erickson had uncovered, it involved resources, planning, and people willing to use a Navy SEAL's call sign as bait. We need to get inside that ship. Marcus stood, decision made. Whatever's happening here, the answers are in there. Sarah shook her head. That ship isn't stable. Engineering reports from 5 years ago said it could collapse any time. Then we'd better not waste time. Marcus checked his sidearm, confirmed the spare magazine in his pocket, ran through the mental checklist that preceded going into places where people might die. Jack, you stay topside, maintain comms. Sarah, you're with me and Reaper. We go in, we look for Erickson, we document what we find, we get out. The entrance was a cargo door hanging open on corroded hinges, metal groaning as wind pushed it back and forth. Marcus paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light, letting Reaper clear the immediate area with her nose and instincts. The temperature dropped 10 degrees, crossing from sunlight to shadow the ship's interior, holding cold the way tombs did. The corridor stretched ahead, rust flaking from walls, water pooling in low spots, the detritus of decades accumulating in corners. But Marcus's attention caught on something that didn't belong: footprints in the rust dust, fresh enough to show tread patterns leading deeper into the ship. Multiple sets, different sizes, recent enough that disturbed dust hadn't settled. Reaper moved forward, not hurrying, checking each intersection before allowing them to proceed. Her training was showing the hundreds of hours spent learning to clear buildings and detect threats too subtle for human senses. Marcus followed his own training, overlaying her movements with tactical awareness. Angles of fire cover positions, the unconscious calculations that separated survivors from casualties. The first room they checked held evidence of recent occupation. Water bottles in a corner, labels still legible. Energy bar wrappers, protein-heavy brands favored by people who needed sustained energy. A battery pack, the kind used to charge phones or tablets, still warm to the touch. Someone had been living here recently enough that their presence hadn't fully faded. Reaper sat alert signal, her nose pointing toward something Marcus couldn't immediately identify. He followed her indication, found a corner where shadows pooled thick. Behind a stack of corroded pipes, a notebook wrapped in plastic protected from moisture. Marcus extracted it carefully, opened it to pages filled with neat handwriting, technical notations, coordinates. The first page showed GPS locations, latitude and longitude precise to the second. Marcus recognized some coordinates. Emerald cut the ranger station points along the Canadian border. Others meant nothing without a map to reference. Beside each coordinate symbols, the kind of shorthand that looked like random marks, unless you knew what you were seeing. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching. "That's maritime salvage notation. My brother Danny used to use it." Marcus flipped pages, finding more symbols, more coordinates, sketches of routes and waypoints. This wasn't a hiker's journal. This was operational planning, the kind of documentation people made when they needed to remember complex logistics without digital trails. The final pages held photographs printed on regular paper, curling at the edges from humidity. The northern star from above, shot from a drone or helicopter. The 4-star logo, large and clear. Maps showing tunnels and routes Marcus didn't recognize. And one photograph that made his blood run cold. SEAL Team 7, the same image hanging on his cabin wall with notation in red marker. 6 killed in action. 5 missing in action. 1 active. The mathematics was wrong. Marcus knew how many had died in the operation that ended his Team 6, including David Cross and Danny Donovan. But 5 missing in action. That didn't match official records. And 1 active should have meant 1 person still serving, but Marcus had retired 6 years ago. Unless someone was operating under classifications that didn't appear in records civilians could access. Unless the team hadn't ended the way Marcus had been told. Unless the whole structure of what he'd believed for 8 years was built on foundations that were crumbling. Reaper growled low and sustained the warning that meant immediate threats. Marcus pocketed the notebook hand, finding his weapon body shifting to position Sarah behind him. The sound came from deeper in the ship, metal on metal, rhythmic and deliberate. Footsteps, but wrong, somehow the timing off. Then he understood. Not footsteps. A recording played through speakers designed to draw them deeper while whoever had been here made their escape. The professional touches kept accumulating, each one adding to the picture of operators who knew what they were doing. But Reaper wasn't looking toward the sound. Her attention had fixed on something else, a hatch partially concealed behind collapsed panels. Marcus approached carefully, Reaper at his side, Sarah maintaining position to cover their 6. The hatch opened onto stairs, descending into darkness, metal treads, disappearing into black. The air rising from below carried the smell of water oil and something else Marcus couldn't immediately identify but recognized from years of experience, human fear, the particular scent people left when they'd spent time terrified. Thomas Erickson had been down there, recently, possibly still was. Marcus pulled a flashlight, the beam cutting through darkness to reveal stairs leading to what must have been the engine room. But before he could descend, his radio crackled with Jack's voice, urgent and tight. "Steele, we've got company." 3 vehicles just pulled into the lot, official-looking but wrong. No markings I recognize. 6 men, all wearing tactical gear. "They're heading your way." Marcus killed the flashlight, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the faint illumination from the corridor behind them. His voice dropped to the tactical whisper that carried without echoing. "How long until they reach the ship?" Jack's response came through, measured but urgent. 4 minutes, maybe 5. They're moving like they know the terrain. Sarah's breathing had quickened beside him, controlled but stressed. "We need to leave, now." Marcus's mind ran the calculations faster than conscious thought could track. 4 minutes to clear the ship, cross exposed ground-reach vehicles that armed professionals would intercept within seconds. The odds approached 0 unless they had information worth more than their capture. His hand found the notebook in his pocket, pages that detailed coordinates and symbols someone wanted badly enough to stage this entire operation. Down. The word came out as decision rather than suggestion. "Whatever Erickson found, it's below us. We have 3 minutes to discover what's worth 6 armed men." Reaper was already descending. Her body language shifted fully into combat mode, ears, flat movements, economical and silent. Marcus followed boots, finding metal treads slick with condensation and decades of rust. Sarah came last, her phone's dim screen providing just enough light to prevent a fall without broadcasting their position. The engine room opened beneath them like a cathedral built for machines instead of gods. Rusted diesel engines rose 15 feet pipes and conduits, creating a maze of metal that swallowed their flashlight beams. Water pooled across the floor, shallow enough to wade but deep enough to reflect their movements in broken fragments. The smell hit Marcus immediately, the unmistakable copper tang overlaying oil and decay. Blood recent enough to remain distinct from the ship's baseline rot. Reaper's posture confirmed what his nose suspected, her body going rigid in the stance that meant human remains ahead. Thomas Erickson sat propped against the far wall, positioned with a deliberateness that made Marcus's chest tighten. The journalist's eyes were closed, head tilted forward, hands behind his back, in a position that suggested restraints removed post-mortem. The entry wound behind his left ear showed professional execution, close range, angled upward through the brainstem. Death would have been instantaneous, no suffering beyond the moments before the trigger pull. Sarah's sharp intake of breath came before she could stop herself. Oh, God. Marcus moved closer, his tactical mind cataloging details while his conscience registered the waste of a life spent asking questions no one wanted answered. Erickson's pockets had been turned inside out, wallet and phone gone, but his boots remained expensive, hiking footwear that would have been the first thing thieves took. This wasn't robbery. This was message. Beside the body, arranged with the same deliberation as Erickson's positioning, sat a black Pelican case, the kind used to protect sensitive equipment from water and impact. Marcus lifted it, felt the weight suggest contents intact, and found it unlocked. Inside, protected by foam cutouts, a laptop, external hard drive, spiral notebooks filled with handwritten notes, and a manila folder thick with photographs. The first photograph showed the Northern Star from above, taken months ago based on vegetation patterns visible on the decks. But the image wasn't focused on the ship itself. Red circles marked the waterline, highlighting details Marcus had to squint to discern ropes, bollards, evidence of vessels mooring against the hull. The Northern Star wasn't abandoned. It was active infrastructure. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands shaking slightly as she lifted the next photograph. This one showed containers, industrial shipping crates, stacked in what looked like a warehouse, each marked with the 4-point star logo. Serial numbers were visible, partial but legible enough for someone with access to shipping databases to trace origins. The notebooks contained transaction records, dates and locations and quantities that read like inventory lists. Erickson had been building a case documentation careful enough for prosecution, detailed enough to survive scrutiny, and someone had killed him before he could publish it. Reaper's low growl pulled Marcus's attention from the evidence. She'd moved to the room's far corner nose, working along the seam where wall met floor. Her signal was subtle but unmistakable. She'd found something humans would miss. Marcus approached, running his hand along the wall until his fingers caught on an irregularity. The panel looked seamless until you knew where pressure released the catch. It swung inward, revealing a compartment 2 feet deep, 3 wide, filled with items that made his pulse quicken despite years of training to remain calm under pressure. Radio equipment, military-grade encryption, frequency ranges that weren't available to civilians. A handheld GPS unit, waypoints programmed for locations throughout the Great Lakes region, and a laminated map showing routes and tunnels Marcus recognized from classified briefings he'd received a decade ago, installations that officially didn't exist but had been maintained throughout the Cold War. The infrastructure beneath Lake Superior had been a Cold War project, tunnels and bunkers designed to move personnel and materiel along the Canadian border without surface detection. Most had been sealed after the Soviet Union collapsed. But sealed didn't mean destroyed, and someone with resources and knowledge had evidently reopened enough of the network to move cargo worth killing over. Sarah's voice came from behind him, tight with realization. This is how they move the weapons. Underwater routes, no customs, no inspections. Marcus photographed everything with his phone, knowing the images might be the only evidence that survived the next few minutes. His radio crackled, Jack's voice carrying the controlled tension of someone watching threats approach. 2 minutes. They've split up, covering multiple entry points. I don't think they're law enforcement. Copy. Marcus made the decision that would either save them or get them killed. Sarah, take the Pelican case. Move back to the stairs, but don't ascend until I signal. Reap with me. The dog followed as he moved to the room's center, positioning himself where the overhead hatch was barely visible in the gloom. The metal trapdoor he'd noticed on approach, camouflaged among pipes and structural supports, would lead to the deck above or provide access to maintenance crawl spaces. Either option beat being trapped in a room with one exit and 6 armed men converging. He was reaching for the hatch's release mechanism when the sound registered metal scraping metal from the corridor they'd descended. Not the random groan of a settling ship, but the deliberate noise of someone moving with purpose, confident enough to not bother with stealth. The voice that followed carried authority and a familiarity that made Marcus's blood freeze. "Falcon, I know you're down there. We need to talk." The call sign, the tone, the particular cadence of speech that triggered memories Marcus had spent years trying to compartmentalize. He knew that voice the way soldiers knew their drill instructors, the way children knew parents, the fundamental recognition that bypassed conscious thought. Victor Grayson had been Marcus's commanding officer for 3 years, the man who'd written recommendations for medals and promotions, who'd made decisions that kept most of his team alive through deployments that killed better men. The last time Marcus had seen him was at David Cross's memorial service, both of them in dress uniforms, neither willing to speak the truths that hung between them like smoke from incense. Sarah's eyes went wide, questioning whether to move or freeze. Marcus gestured toward the stairs, insistent. "Go. Now." She hesitated 1 second before trusting his judgment, moving with the speed of someone who'd realized conversations in killing rooms rarely ended well for bystanders. Reaper stayed at Marcus's side, her loyalty overriding survival instinct, prepared to die beside him if that's what the next minutes required. Marcus's voice came out steady despite his pulse hammering. "Admiral Grayson. Didn't expect Navy brass at a crime scene." Footsteps descended, measured and unhurried. "I'm retired, remember private sector now, maritime security consulting, very lucrative for someone with my experience." The man who emerged from the stairwell wore civilian clothes, expensive outdoor gear that managed to look tactical without being overtly military. Victor Grayson at 56 carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command gray at his temples, face weathered by years of decisions that cost other people more than they cost him. 2 men followed him, both younger, both moving with the fluid economy that marked former special operations. They held weapons low and ready fingers, indexed along trigger guards, professional enough to shoot if required, but disciplined enough to wait for orders. Grayson's gaze moved from Marcus to Erickson's body without apparent emotion. Unfortunate business. Erickson was warned to stop digging. Some questions don't have answers. People survive learning. You killed him. Marcus kept his hand near his sidearm, knowing the gesture was probably futile against 3 armed men, but unwilling to go down passive. Grayson's expression showed something that might have been regret or might have been practiced sympathy. "I tried to prevent this. Offered him money to drop the investigation, even arranged a job overseas that would have kept him safely occupied. He declined." Some journalists think their stories matter more than their lives. The Pelican case was gone. Sarah hopefully moving fast enough to reach safety before Grayson's people thought to check the exits. But the evidence photographed on Marcus's phone still existed encrypted and backed up to cloud storage that would sync the moment he reached cell coverage. Unless Grayson planned to kill everyone who'd seen Erickson's documentation, the information would survive. "You're using Cold War tunnels to move weapons." Marcus said it as statement rather than question, watching Grayson's face for confirmation or denial. The older man's smile was thin, acknowledging without admitting. The infrastructure was already there, paid for by taxpayers, maintained by people who understood discretion. Seemed wasteful to let it sit unused when there's such demand for certain products in certain markets. "So you became an arms dealer. How does that square with the oath you took?" Grayson's expression hardened, the genial mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "I spent 30 years watching politicians send good men to die for causes they'd abandoned before the bodies came home. watched budgets get slashed while enemies got stronger. The oath was to defend this country falcon. Sometimes that means operating outside the lines bureaucrats draw. The rationalization was familiar, the same logic that had corrupted better men throughout history. Righteousness as cover for profit, patriotism as excuse for crimes. Marcus had heard variations in Iraq, Afghanistan, every theater where war created opportunities for people willing to trade lives for margins. David Cross figured it out. Marcus threw the words like stones, watching for impact. He found evidence, tried to expose you, so you killed him too. Grayson's face showed genuine pain or a convincing simulation. David was collateral damage from an operation that went sideways. I tried to extract him, but the timeline collapsed. What happened in Kandahar wasn't murder, it was failure to prevent tragedy. The distinction seemed important to Grayson in ways Marcus couldn't fathom. A man was dead either way, along with 5 others who'd trusted their commander to make decisions that valued their lives above operational objectives. Whether through action or inaction, Grayson bore responsibility for deaths he now rationalized as necessary sacrifices. Reaper's growl intensified, her body coiled for violence, waiting only for Marcus's signal to attack. The 2 armed men shifted their aim slightly, fingers moving from indexed to triggers. The room had shrunk to the space between heartbeats the moment before irreversible decisions got made. Grayson raised one hand, a command for his people to hold fire. "Marcus, you're a smart man. You understand how the world actually works." This journalist he was, nobody chasing a story that would have compromised operations that keep bad weapons out of worse hands. Sometimes the greater good requires accepting smaller evils. And the 6 people on your team who died, Marcus's voice carried the weight of 8 years of survivor's guilt. Were they smaller evils too? The slap came fast, Grayson's control breaking for 1 second before reasserting itself. Those men were heroes who died serving their country. Don't you dare cheapen their sacrifice. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if it wasn't backed by armed men willing to enforce Grayson's version of reality. Marcus's tactical assessment remained grim, 3 against 1. Clear fields of fire, no cover worth the name. His only advantage was Reaper, whose training and ferocity might buy seconds if violence erupted. But seconds were all Sarah needed to reach the vehicles with evidence that could survive, even if Marcus didn't. His phone's last backup had been 3 minutes ago. Everything Erickson had documented, everything Marcus had photographed, existed in digital form beyond Grayson's reach. The information would outlive them all. "You're not walking out of here with that case." Grayson's tone had shifted, negotiation abandoned for threat. "And your phone is going in the lake. This ends today one way or another." Marcus felt the truth of his situation settle with the weight of standing orders received in combat. No good options remained, only choices about how to die. He could surrender hope. Grayson valued old loyalty enough to kill him quickly. He could fight, take maybe one of them down before bullets found him. Or he could buy Sarah time to escape, to deliver evidence to people who might actually seek justice instead of complicity. The decision made itself muscle memory from 1,000 tactical situations overriding conscious thought. His hand dropped to Reaper's harness, 3 rapid taps that signaled the command they'd practiced but never used in 8 years: run, hide, survive. Reaper resisted for 1 heartbeat, loyalty warring with training before her discipline overcame emotion. She bolted for the stairs, low and fast, a black and tan blur that cleared 20 feet before Grayson's men could track her movement. "Shoot the dog!" Grayson's command came harsh and immediate. Marcus's weapon cleared leather as both men swung their aim toward the fleeing dog. His first round caught the nearest shooter in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. The second round went wide as return fire forced Marcus behind the limited cover of a steel pillar. The gunfight lasted 8 seconds, an eternity, compressed into muzzle flashes and ricochets the confined space, turning every shot into 3 as bullets bounced off metal surfaces. Marcus's training kept him moving, not staying behind cover long enough to be flanked, squeezing rounds at targets barely visible through smoke and shadow. Then the world tilted. The explosion came from above, charges placed with precision to collapse specific structural supports. Marcus had 1 second to recognize the trap before the ceiling buckled, metal shrieking as tons of steel surrendered to gravity. He dove toward the trapdoor he'd spotted earlier, fingers catching the release mechanism as the floor beneath him buckled. The hatch opened onto a maintenance tunnel, narrow and dark, angling upward through the ship's infrastructure. Marcus pulled himself through as the engine room collapsed behind him, the roar of falling metal drowning out screams or curses from the men who'd been trying to kill him. The tunnel was barely wider than his shoulders, claustrophobic and disorienting, offering only one direction, forward and up. He crawled through darkness, knees and elbows finding purchase on corroded rungs, breathing air thick with rust and fear. Behind him, the sounds of destruction faded to groans as the ship settled into its new configuration spaces that had held shape for decades, finally surrendering to entropy. Light appeared ahead, gray and filtered through grating. Marcus pushed toward it, emerging into a cargo hold 3 decks above the engine room. He lay on the metal floor for 30 seconds, lungs pulling, air mind cataloging injuries. Bruises, cuts, hearing damaged by gunfire and explosions, but nothing that would prevent movement. Reaper found him before he'd fully stood, emerging from shadows, with the purposeful trot of someone who'd completed her mission and returned to duty. She circled him once, checking for injuries with her nose, then positioned herself between Marcus and the hold's exit. The ship groaned again, a deep metallic complaint that suggested structural integrity was approaching failure. They needed to leave immediately before the Northern Star completed its long-delayed appointment with the lake bottom. But first, Marcus needed to confirm what his training insisted must be true. He descended toward the engine room, carefully staying clear of the main collapse zone, approaching from an auxiliary corridor. The room where he'd fought Grayson was buried under twisted metal, the ceiling having pancaked onto the floor with force sufficient to crush anything caught between. No movement, no sounds of survivors, just the settling of wreckage and the slow trickle of water, finding new paths through compromised hull plating. If Grayson and his men had survived, they'd be trapped for hours, maybe days, depending on whether they had tools to cut through steel. If they'd died, the collapse had been quick enough to be merciful. Either way, Marcus had bought time and eliminated immediate threats. He photographed the destruction, adding documentation to files already uploaded. Then he moved toward Daylight, Reaper at his side, both of them covered in rust and blood and the residue of survival. Jack was waiting at the Northern Star's entrance, weapon-drawn expression, cycling through relief and professional assessment. Behind him, Sheriff Hayes's vehicle was pulling into the lot, followed by an ambulance and 2 deputy cruisers. Sarah stood beside Jack, the Pelican case clutched against her chest, face pale but composed. The next 3 hours blurred together official responses, layering over tactical realities. Sheriff Hayes took statements professional, but clearly overwhelmed by a situation that had escalated beyond missing hikers into territory involving federal crimes and military conspiracies. Marcus edited his account carefully, confirming the discovery of Erickson's body, omitting details about Grayson's involvement until he understood the full scope of complicity. The FBI arrived as the sun touched the Western Horizon agents in suits that looked absurd against the backdrop of rusted ships and wilderness. They secured the Northern Star as a crime scene, cordoning off areas Marcus had just escaped, beginning the methodical process of evidence collection that would take weeks. But evidence collection had already happened, photographs and documents stored in cloud servers beyond anyone's immediate reach. Marcus had played this game before, knew the difference between official investigations that sought truth and official investigations that buried it. Until he understood which category this one fell into, he'd keep the most damaging evidence close. Lisa Chen arrived with the second wave of FBI personnel, her credentials identifying her as a digital forensics specialist assigned to the Cybercrimes Division. She was younger than Marcus expected, maybe 32, wearing practical field clothes instead of bureau standard, approaching situations with the directness of someone who'd learned that technical expertise mattered more than political navigation. Her first question bypassed pleasantries entirely. The laptop from the Pelican case is encrypted. Military grade, probably NSA-level algorithms. You know anyone who might have that kind of expertise? Marcus considered lying, decided against it. Erickson was investigating arms trafficking. Military encryption suggests his sources were inside government or defense contractors. Lisa's expression suggested she'd reached the same conclusion hours ago, but wanted confirmation from someone who'd actually been present. I need to establish a timeline. When did you discover the body? The debriefing took 90 minutes. Lisa's questions precise and probing, designed to extract maximum information while revealing minimal agency knowledge. Marcus recognized the technique, had used it himself during intelligence debriefs, the careful dance of learning what someone knew without teaching them what they shouldn't. By the time she finished, night had settled fully over Lake Superior, the northern star reduced to a dark silhouette against darker water. Emergency lights from law enforcement vehicles cast moving shadows across the cliff face, creating an atmosphere more crime drama than reality. Lisa closed her notebook, studied Marcus with the intensity of someone making calculations about trust and risk. Off the record, what aren't you telling me? Everything that mattered, everything that would get people killed or buried or both. But Marcus's answer stayed neutral. I told you what I found. What you do with it determines whether justice happens or gets archived. She nodded, accepting the implicit challenge. The encryption should take our best people 3 to 5 days to crack. But if someone wanted faster results and had expertise with legacy military systems, they could probably bypass the primary security in 12 to 18 hours. The offer was clear without being explicit. Lisa was giving him time, permission, even to extract information before official channels locked everything behind clearances and classifications. Whether that represented honest investigation or clever entrapment, Marcus couldn't determine from one conversation. His phone buzzed, Sarah's text simple and urgent. Need to talk. Private. Now. They met at Sarah's ranger station, the building empty this late, only emergency lights providing illumination. She'd made coffee strong enough to strip paint, the kind people drank when sleep wasn't an option. Her hands shook slightly as she set down her mug. I lied earlier. About not knowing anything. Marcus waited, letting silence create space for confession. Danny, my brother, he didn't just serve with you. He was investigating. Grayson had been for 6 months before Kandahar. Thought something was wrong with the operation timelines equipment that went missing, intel that felt staged. He sent me files, told me if anything happened to get them to people who could act on them. And Marcus kept his voice neutral, but his pulse had quickened. I buried them. Sarah's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. After he died, I was so angry, so broken, I convinced myself Danny had been paranoid. That looking for conspiracies was easier than accepting he'd died in combat. So I deleted everything, burned the hard copies, tried to forget. But there was always a but, with confessions this heavy. But I backed everything up first. Sarah pulled a thumb drive from her pocket, the small device holding weight beyond its physical mass. Everything Danny collected, every suspicion, every document he thought proved Grayson was compromised. I haven't looked at it in 8 years, couldn't face it. But after today, after seeing Erickson's body, I think maybe Danny was right. Marcus accepted the drive, feeling the plastic warm from her pocket. Why tell me now? Because Grayson called you Falcon. Because he knew you'd be here. Because this whole thing feels like a trap that's been waiting years to spring. She met his eyes, her expression carrying the weight of 8 years of doubt and guilt. And because if Danny died trying to expose the truth, the least I can do is help finish what he started. The drive went into Marcus's pocket, joining the notebook he'd taken from the ship. Between Erickson's documentation, Danny Donovan's files, and the photographs Marcus had captured, they had the foundation of a case that might survive scrutiny, if they lived long enough to present it. Reaper had been resting in the corner, conserving energy in the way of working dogs who understood missions might last days, but now she stood, ears swiveling toward the door, body tensing in the preparatory stance that preceded alerts. Marcus's hand found his weapon before conscious thought engaged. What is it, girl? She moved to the window, nose against glass, focused on something in the darkness beyond the emergency light's reach. Her growl started low, building slowly, the kind that meant threats were approaching rather than present. Sarah killed the interior lights, plunging them into darkness. Through the window, barely visible in starlight, 3 figures moved through the trees, approaching the station with the tactical spacing of people who'd done this before. They found us. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Or they've been watching all along. Marcus moved away from the window, mind running escape routes and defensive positions. Back door leads to the maintenance shed, From there, 50 yards to the tree line if we move fast. The front door's lock rattled someone testing it before deciding whether to breach. Marcus gestured for Sarah to move, covering her withdrawal, while Reaper maintained position, tracking the figures through wall and window with senses humans couldn't match. They made it to the back door before glass shattered in the front, the sound of window breaking, followed by footsteps on linoleum. Professional entry, multiple points, coordination that spoke to training and equipment. Not Grayson's people, he was trapped or dead in the Northern Star. Someone else with resources to field teams hours after the initial confrontation. The maintenance shed provided minimal cover but enough concealment to reach the forest. Marcus moved first, weapon ready, scanning for additional threats. Sarah followed, her breathing controlled, despite obvious fear. Reaper came last, backing toward them while maintaining visual contact with the station. They were 20 yards into the trees when the explosion lit the night, the ranger station erupting in flames that reached 50 feet skyward. The blast wave arrived seconds later, hot air and debris knocking them flat against earth that trembled from the detonation. Marcus's ears rang, his vision spotted, but training overrode disorientation. He grabbed Sarah's arm, pulled her upright, gestured for Reaper to move. They ran through darkness, branches whipping faces, roots threatening ankles, the kind of movement that invited injury but prevented death. Behind them, voices shouted coordinates and vectors, people with night vision and radios hunting through trees with the systematic approach of professionals who'd done this before. Marcus led them up slope away from obvious routes, using terrain and vegetation to break sight lines. They found cover in a deadfall massive pine that had toppled in some forgotten storm, creating a hollow space beneath its trunk. Marcus pulled them into the shelter, all three pressed together in darkness, breathing hard, listening to their pursuers spread through the forest like a net designed to catch anything that moved. Sarah's whisper was barely audible over his damaged hearing. "Who are they?" Marcus checked his phone, surprised to find signal this deep in forest. His encrypted backup was still running files, uploading despite everything. "Whoever they are, they want us dead before we can share what we know." The thumb drive and notebook were still secure in his pocket. The evidence existed in multiple locations, now distributed enough that killing them wouldn't eliminate the information. But explaining that to people shooting at them required surviving long enough to have the conversation. Reaper pressed against his side, her warmth and solidity, an anchor in chaos. He could feel her heartbeat elevated but controlled the physiological response of someone prepared for extended operations. She'd been bred for this, selected across generations for traits that kept humans alive in situations designed to kill them. The hunters passed within 20 feet, flashlight beams cutting through underbrush, radios crackling with coordination. Marcus counted 6 distinct voices, professional communication, that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. They were searching patterns, not random thrashing, the kind of systematic coverage that would eventually find anyone who stayed stationary. "We have to move." Marcus said it quietly, statement rather than question. "They'll grid search until they find us or run out of dark." Sarah nodded, her face barely visible in starlight filtering through pine needles. "Where the lake?" Marcus had made the decision while listening to their hunters' movements. "They're searching inland, expecting us to run for roads or civilization. We go to the water, follow the shore, put distance between us before they realize we didn't take the obvious routes." They emerged from this deadfall, carefully keeping low, using shadows and vegetation for concealment. The descent to the shore was treacherous in darkness, loose rock and steep grades that required trust in footing more than vision. But pursuers' voices faded as they moved, the search pattern expanding away from their actual location. Lake Superior's shore was a chaos of boulders and driftwood, creating terrain that slowed movement but offered countless hiding spots. They picked their way north, keeping water within sight, pausing frequently to listen for pursuit. An hour passed, then 2. The explosions and chaos at the ranger station felt distant problems from another lifetime. Marcus's phone showed 3:47 a.m. when they finally stopped to rest, finding shelter in an overhang that provided protection from wind and concealment from sight. Sarah slumped against rock, exhaustion overriding adrenaline. "We can't keep running. We need help. Real help, people with resources to protect us." "Who do you trust?" Marcus asked it seriously, genuinely wanting her assessment. FBI. They're already involved. Local law enforcement Sheriff Hayes seemed overwhelmed before someone blew up your station. Federal agencies Grayson had connections throughout DOD and intelligence communities. Sarah didn't answer because no good answer existed. The infrastructure meant to protect citizens from threats had been compromised by people who understood how to exploit trust and authority. Seeking help from systems that might be corrupted risked delivering themselves to the people hunting them. Marcus checked his phone again, found the backup complete. Erickson's files, his own photographs, Danny Donovan's documents all existed in encrypted storage that would survive even if they didn't. The question was whether anyone would know to look for them, and whether they'd have the courage to act on what they found. Reaper's soft whine pulled his attention from screens to immediate surroundings. She was looking toward the water body tents, but not alarmed, tracking something Marcus couldn't yet perceive. A boat small and running without lights was gliding along the shore 40 yards out. Electric motor nearly silent, moving with the purposeful vector of someone who knew exactly where they were going. As it passed their position, Marcus caught a glimpse of the pilot's silhouette against starlit water posture, suggesting familiarity with night operations. The boat continued north, disappearing around a headland, leaving questions Marcus couldn't answer. Friend or threat, search party or smuggler, legitimate or complicit. The darkness held too many possibilities to distinguish truth from deception. Sarah had fallen asleep against the rock, her body's demand for rest overriding circumstances. Marcus envied her that ability, his own mind too active with tactical planning and threat assessment to shut down. He'd sleep when safety allowed, however many hours or days that required. Reaper settled at his feet, head on paws, eyes reflecting starlight like amber pools. She wasn't sleeping either, maintaining watch over people who'd become pack worth protecting. Marcus rested his hand on her shoulder, feeling muscles ready beneath fur, grateful for loyalty that didn't require explanations or justifications. The first hints of dawn were touching the eastern horizon when his phone buzzed a message from an unknown number consisting of 3 words and a set of coordinates. Truth has costs. The coordinates led to a boat launch 15 miles north of Emerald Cut, accessible only by fire roads that hadn't seen maintenance since the previous administration cared about infrastructure. Marcus drove Sarah's truck, the vehicle having survived the ranger station's destruction by virtue of being parked near the tree line when explosives turned the building into a crater. Dawn was breaking properly now, pale light turning Lake Superior from black to slate gray, revealing a landscape that looked unchanged since glaciers had last reshaped it. Sarah had woken 20 minutes earlier, disoriented and aching, her face showing the particular exhaustion that came from running on adrenaline too long before the body demanded payment. The boat launch was empty except for a single vehicle, a nondescript sedan with government plates that might as well have carried a sign reading, "Federal Agent Present." Marcus parked 50 yards back, positioning for quick departure if this meeting turned hostile. Reaper was already alert, scanning the area with systematic thoroughness, cataloging threats against baseline normal. Lisa Chen emerged from the sedan wearing clothes she'd clearly slept in if she'd slept at all. Her laptop bag suggested she'd been working through the night, the kind of sustained focus that separated competent investigators from exceptional ones. She approached Marcus's truck directly, no pretense of casual encounter. "Get in. My vehicle has better encryption against listening devices." Her tone carried the flat authority of someone who'd already assessed risks and made decisions. Marcus gestured for Sarah to stay with Reaper, then followed Lisa to her sedan. The interior smelled of coffee and electronics, the back seat covered in equipment that belonged in a forensics lab rather than a field vehicle. Lisa started the engine, ran a device across the dashboard, and doors waited for green lights confirming no active surveillance, then turned to face him. Victor Grayson's body was recovered 3 hours ago from the Northern Star's engine room, crushed when the ceiling collapsed. 2 of his men are still missing, presumed buried under debris. Official cause will be listed as structural failure during unauthorized entry. Her delivery was clinical, reporting facts without judgment. Marcus processed the information, found himself surprised by the absence of emotion. Grayson had been his commander, someone he'd trusted with his life, whose betrayal cut deeper than enemy action ever could. But the man had died because he'd chosen profit over principles, had killed people trying to expose crimes hidden behind classified operations. Justice was too clean a word for what happened, but consequences fit. Unofficial cause. Marcus asked it, knowing Lisa wouldn't volunteer information without reason. Someone placed shaped charges on specific support columns, then detonated them remotely during the firefight. The blast pattern suggests demolition expertise, probably military combat engineers. Lisa pulled up photographs on her tablet showing the destruction from angles that required drone access to crime scenes. Whoever set those charges knew exactly how to collapse that room while leaving the rest of the ship structurally intact. Marcus's mind raced through implications. The engine room collapse had been deliberate assassination disguised as collateral damage, eliminating Grayson while creating plausible deniability. But who had resources and motivation to kill a retired admiral involved in arms trafficking? Competitors' partners worried about exposure, or government agencies cleaning up operations that had gotten too visible. The laptop encryption broke 4 hours ago. Lisa's fingers moved across her keyboard, pulling up files that represented Thomas Erickson's final months of investigation. What we found connects to at least 7 federal agencies, 3 defense contractors, and shipping routes that move weapons from U.S. military stockpiles to buyers in 43 countries. Sarah had joined them, unable to maintain distance when information this critical was being discussed. Her face reflected the same sick realization Marcus felt, understanding that the conspiracy wasn't rogue operation, but systematic infrastructure involving enough powerful people to make prosecution nearly impossible. Lisa continued her screen showing transaction records and shipping manifests that represented hundreds of millions in illegal arms sales. The Northern Star was just one node in a network using decommissioned vessels and Cold War infrastructure. Grayson ran the Great Lakes region, but he reported to someone higher. Someone who's managed to stay invisible through 6 presidential administrations. Who Marcus asked it, knowing the answer might get them all killed. We don't know yet. Erickson's files use a designation Granite. No name, no description, just references to someone who makes final decisions on major transactions. Lisa's expression suggested she'd spent hours trying to identify Granite without success. But Erickson documented a meeting scheduled for tomorrow night, location listed as Waypoint 7. Marcus recognized the term from documents he'd photographed in the ship. Waypoint 7 had appeared on maps showing the tunnel network, a junction point where multiple underground routes converged. If Granite was attending personally, the location would need to support high-level security and secrecy, probably deep enough underground that electronic surveillance couldn't penetrate. Sarah had pulled out her brother's thumb drive, the device she'd kept hidden for 8 years, while guilt and fear warred with duty. Danny found Waypoint 7. He sent me coordinates, access codes, everything needed to infiltrate during a scheduled meeting. That's why they killed him. Not because of what he knew, but because of what he could prove. She handed the drive to Lisa, who accepted it with the reverence due evidence that had cost lives to obtain. The digital forensics specialist plugged it into an isolated laptop, one hardened against malware and remote access. Files began populating, years of investigation compressed into gigabytes of documentation. Lisa's eyes widened as she scanned file names and contents. This is architectural plans for the entire tunnel system, engineering specifications, security protocols, guard rotations. Danny must have had access to classified infrastructure databases. He was signals intelligence. Sarah's voice carried pride and grief in equal measure. If data existed electronically, Danny could find it. He spent 6 months mapping the network before he understood what it was being used for. The plan showed complexity. Marcus hadn't imagined tunnels extending hundreds of miles beneath Lake Superior and surrounding territory, connecting sites that officially had no relationship to each other. Some routes dated to World War II, built to move materiel along the Canadian border. Others were Cold War additions meant to survive nuclear strikes. The newest sections appeared to be 20 years old, suggesting the network had been maintained and expanded long after official decommissioning. Waypoint 7 sat at a junction 90 feet below the lake bed, accessible through 3 separate entrance points. The facility included storage areas, living quarters, communications equipment, everything needed to support extended operations away from surface observation. According to Danny's files, meetings happened quarterly, bringing together principals from what amounted to a board of directors for international arms trafficking. Marcus studied the layout, his tactical mind automatically identifying defensive positions and vulnerabilities. The primary entrance required passing through 3 security checkpoints, each featuring biometric verification and armed guards. But Danny had marked a maintenance tunnel designed for emergency evacuation that bypassed most security if you had access codes. "We need to be there." Marcus said it with the certainty of someone who understood that some battles chose you regardless of preparation. "If Granite attends that meeting tomorrow night, it's our chance to identify him and gather evidence that can't be dismissed as conspiracy theory." Lisa shook her head, professional caution asserting itself. "This is beyond civilian capabilities. We need to bring in federal law enforcement coordinate with agencies that can deploy tactical teams." Which agencies? Sarah's question cut through the fantasy of official response. How many federal employees are on Grayson's payroll? How many judges approved warrants that protected these operations? We bring in law enforcement. We're just warning Granite to disappear. The truth sat heavily between them, the recognition that trust in institutions required believing those institutions weren't compromised. But 8 years of cover-ups and convenient deaths suggested otherwise, painted a picture of corruption deep enough that official channels might be exactly what Granite wanted them to use. Marcus's phone buzzed, another message from the unknown number. Shadow's daughter remembers her mother's scent. "Trust what she tells you." He showed the screen to Lisa and Sarah, watching their expressions cycle through confusion and realization. Only a handful of people knew about Shadow the K-9, who'd worked with David Cross and died in Kandahar. Fewer still would understand the significance of Reaper being Shadow's offspring, information Marcus himself had only suspected until this moment. "We need to verify something." Marcus returned to his truck, opened the rear door where Reaper waited with patience that suggested she'd known this moment was approaching. He retrieved the old collar from the gear bag, the leather cracked and faded, and held it where she could scent it thoroughly. Reaper's reaction was immediate and profound. She whined, high-pitched and urgent, pressing her nose against leather that had touched her mother's neck, breathing in molecules that carried information humans couldn't access. Her tail-tucked body language shifting to something between mourning and recognition, understanding that transcended training or conscious thought. Marcus knelt beside her, one hand on her shoulder, feeling tremors run through muscle and bone. "Easy, girl. I know she was yours." The pieces were assembling into a picture Marcus wished he could unsee. Victor Grayson had given him Reaper not from kindness, but as surveillance asset, probably equipped with tracking devices so sophisticated Marcus's periodic sweeps hadn't detected them. But somewhere in Reaper's genetics, Shadow's loyalty had overridden programmed objectives, had recognized David Cross's friend as family worth protecting. Lisa approached cautiously, her investigator's mind clearly running parallel calculations. K-9 handlers often keep offspring of exceptional working dogs. If Shadow died in 2017 and Reaper came to you in 2019, the timeline fits for birth, training, and assignment. But why me specifically? Marcus asked it aloud, working through logic that felt like betrayal, layered on betrayal. Grayson retired 4 years ago. He had no official authority to assign military assets. He had connections. Sarah's voice was tight with anger. Danny's files show Grayson maintained relationships throughout DoD and intelligence communities. He could have pulled strings, forged paperwork, manufactured justification for placing Reaper with you. As surveillance. Marcus finished the thought, feeling sick. To monitor whether I suspected anything about the arms network or David's death. But she chose you anyway. Lisa's observation carried weight beyond simple fact. Whatever they planned, they didn't account for genetics and loyalty stronger than conditioning. She's not their asset. She's your partner. Reaper leaned against Marcus's leg, the gesture conveying trust and apology and determination. He scratched behind her ears, the motion automatic from years of partnership, and made a decision that would either save lives or end them. We go to Waypoint 7, tomorrow night when Granite attends his board meeting. We gather evidence, we identify everyone involved, and we make sure the information reaches people who will actually act on it. Sarah nodded immediately, her brother's sacrifice demanding completion. Lisa took longer professional caution, warring with personal conviction before she too accepted the inevitable. I can provide technical support, encryption, and communications, but I can't officially sanction this. If it goes wrong, the Bureau will disavow any knowledge. Understood. Marcus had operated without official sanction before knew the difference between orders and necessity. We'll need equipment, planning time, and a secure location to stage from. I have a cabin. Sarah's offer came without hesitation. 20 miles north off-grid, used for seasonal rangers who need isolation during firewatch. No one knows about it except forestry personnel. They spent the next hour transferring equipment and files, consolidating resources while maintaining protocols against surveillance. Lisa provided encrypted phones, laptop with hardened security and access credentials for databases that would help them identify faces when the meeting occurred. Sarah contributed detailed knowledge of local terrain and forestry service infrastructure that might provide escape routes. By the time they reached Sarah's cabin, the sun had fully risen, revealing a structure more functional than comfortable. Single-room wood stove, minimal amenities, but walls thick enough to provide privacy and location remote enough to discourage casual discovery. Marcus swept for electronic surveillance. From habit, found nothing beyond natural background radiation and wildlife frequencies. Reaper explored the perimeter, nose working systematically, cataloging scents that would serve as baseline for detecting intrusions. She moved with renewed purpose, as if understanding that something fundamental had shifted, that the pretense of retirement was over, and they were operational again. Lisa spread architectural plans across the cabin's single table. Danny Donovan's documentation showing Waypoint 7 in detail that required years of patient intelligence gathering. The maintenance tunnel entrance was located beneath an abandoned lighthouse 15 miles up the coast, accessible through a concealed hatch that required both physical key and electronic access code. Danny's notes indicated guard rotations changed every 6 hours, with overlap periods providing maximum coverage but also maximum confusion when personnel transitioned. The optimal infiltration window occurred during shift change, approximately 40 minutes, when old guards were eager to depart, and new guards were still settling into positions. But infiltration was only the first challenge. Once inside, they'd need to navigate 90 feet of vertical descent, followed by horizontal tunnels extending nearly half a mile before reaching the junction chamber where meetings occurred. The route included pressure doors, camera coverage, and motion sensors that would detect unauthorized movement. Sarah traced the path with one finger, her expression grim. Even if we bypass exterior security, we're looking at multiple failure points where a single mistake alerts everyone in the facility. We don't bypass security. Marcus had fought in enough denied areas to understand that perfect infiltration was fantasy. We use legitimate access, someone with credentials that allow movement through the facility without triggering alerts. All three of them recognized the problem simultaneously. Legitimate access required being part of the organization, which meant recruiting someone already involved in trafficking, convincing them to commit treason against people who demonstrated willingness to kill for silence. Unless we create new credentials. Lisa's fingers were already moving across her keyboard, pulling up personnel databases that should have required federal warrants to access. The security system uses biometric verification, but the underlying database is accessible through DoD personnel records. If I can insert a phantom identity, someone who exists on paper but hasn't been assigned to Waypoint 7, yet we might slip through. How long? Marcus asked. 12 hours. She was typing as she spoke, code scrolling across screens faster than Marcus could follow. I need to create employment history, security clearances, biometric profiles that match your physical characteristics. And it all has to be clean enough to survive scrutiny if anyone checks. Which leaves us one day to prepare for infiltration and execution. Sarah was already pulling weapons from a locked cabinet, the kind of firearms forestry personnel weren't supposed to maintain, but pragmatic ones did anyway. We'll need tactical gear, communications equipment, and extraction plans for when everything goes wrong. Marcus spent the next 6 hours in the kind of focused preparation that preceded operations, where success measured in survivors rather than objectives achieved. He field-stripped and cleaned weapons, verified ammunition compatibility, assembled medical supplies that could address everything from gunshot wounds to exposure. Sarah worked communications, setting up relay points and dead drops that would preserve information even if they didn't survive to deliver it personally. Lisa remained absorbed in her laptop, building a digital identity from fragments of legitimate records and carefully constructed lies. The name she chose was Owen Drake, a composite of 3 real federal agents whose careers had overlapped enough to create plausible history. The biometrics required actual measurements from Marcus photographs taken at specific angles, fingerprints scanned and processed until they matched the quality database systems expected. By evening, Owen Drake existed as thoroughly as any real person, complete with service records showing 5 years as FBI special agent focused on weapons trafficking, current assignment to the Northern District of Minnesota Field Office security clearances that granted access to classified facilities. The identity would survive casual verification, probably hold up under moderate scrutiny, but collapse immediately if someone with genuine authority decided to investigate deeply. Good enough. Marcus studied the credentials on Lisa's screen, memorizing details he'd need to maintain the deception. How do we get the biometrics into their system? That's the elegant part. Lisa's smile showed genuine satisfaction with her solution. The Northern Star recovery operation created legitimate reason to update facility access lists. I'm using my actual FBI credentials to submit a request, adding Owen Drake to authorized personnel, citing need for investigator access to Cold War infrastructure during the investigation. The request goes through official channels, looks completely legitimate, and will be approved by automated systems before any human reviews it. And if a human does review it, Sarah asked, then we have maybe 12 hours before someone questions why an FBI agent they've never heard of needs access to a facility that officially doesn't exist. Lisa closed her laptop, exhaustion finally showing through professional composure. Which means we infiltrate tomorrow night at 2100 hours or not at all. Marcus checked the time. They had 36 hours until the scheduled meeting at Waypoint 7. Enough time to prepare, but not enough to recover from mistakes. He'd operated on worse timelines in places where failure meant death, or capture, where success was measured by making it another day rather than completing missions. But those operations had occurred under orders from chain of command, with support infrastructure and extraction plans developed by people whose job was keeping operators alive. This was different. 3 people and a dog against an organization wealthy and connected enough to corrupt federal agencies operating in facilities designed to resist military assault. The odds suggested they'd die down there probably quickly once their deception was discovered. But Thomas Erickson had died asking questions that deserved answers. David Cross and 5 others had been killed to protect operations that turned American weapons into terrorist tools, and Danny Donovan had spent his last months gathering evidence that could end the network if anyone was brave enough to use it. Some debts couldn't be paid except in blood or justice, and Marcus was tired of wondering which currency his life would spend. Loyalty is the only currency that survives the spending. He thought, watching Reaper settle beside the wood stove, her eyes reflecting firelight like promises kept across generations. Reaper pressed against his leg, the contact grounding him in present, rather than allowing rumination about futures that might not arrive. He looked down at her, this dog who'd been given to him as surveillance but chosen loyalty, whose mother had died beside David Cross, whose genetics carried memory of service and sacrifice across generations. You don't have to do this. Marcus spoke it aloud, knowing she couldn't answer, but needing to acknowledge her autonomy. The infiltration will be dangerous, probably lethal. You could stay here safe. She tilted her head, dark eyes holding his gaze, and Marcus understood the response without words. Partnership meant facing threats together, meant trusting each other in situations where separation guaranteed failure. Reaper had chosen him years ago, had saved his life repeatedly, and wasn't about to stop now just because the danger had escalated. Fine. But you follow my lead, stay close, and if I give the command to run, you run. Marcus made it as close to an order as he could manage, knowing she'd interpret it through the lens of their relationship, rather than accepting it as absolute directive. Sarah had spread sleeping bags across the cabin's floor, creating rest areas that acknowledged they'd be spending the night preparing rather than sleeping. Lisa claimed one immediately, her body demanding recovery after however many hours she'd been functioning on caffeine and determination. Marcus took first watch, positioning himself where he could monitor approaches while reviewing architectural plans until they were memorized. The maintenance tunnel required descending through a vertical shaft emergency ladder, providing the only access. Once at depth, they'd navigate through passages barely wide enough for single file, no room to maneuver if they encountered resistance. The junction chamber itself was more problematic. A circular space 30 feet in diameter with 6 tunnel entrances. Sight lines were terrible, acoustic properties would carry sound too well, and escape routes were limited to whichever tunnels weren't occupied by hostiles. The meeting configuration showed a central table with seating for 12, suggesting they'd be facing at least that many participants, plus however many security personnel the facility maintained. Sarah relieved him at midnight, her movements quiet and competent, someone who'd learned to function in wilderness that punished mistakes. She studied him for a moment before speaking, choosing words carefully. "Danny would have liked you, trusted you. He always said the real operators were the ones who understood that violence was last resort, not first option." Marcus accepted the assessment without commentary, recognizing it as Sarah's way of processing grief through connection to people her brother had respected. He settled into a sleeping bag that smelled of storage and mildew, Reaper arranging herself at his side, warmth and weight and loyalty condensed into 70 pounds of muscle and determination. Sleep came in fragments, punctuated by dreams that blurred past and present Kandahar and Minnesota friends who'd died and threats still living. He woke at 5:30 to gray light filtering through windows, Reaper already alert, Sarah making coffee that would be strong enough to power vehicles. Lisa emerged looking worse than she'd gone to sleep, the kind of exhaustion that came from mind refusing to rest even when body demanded it. She checked her laptop, compulsively verified that Owen Drake's credentials had been approved and entered into Waypoint 7's security database, then ran scenarios about what could go wrong with the timing. "We leave at 1900 to reach the lighthouse before dark." Marcus was assembling gear, the familiar ritual of preparation that preceded operations. Infiltration at 2100 timed to coincide with shift change. Meeting is scheduled for 2200, which gives us 1 hour to get into position. "What about extraction?" Sarah asked the question that mattered most. "Once we're inside, how do we get out?" "We don't." Marcus said it flatly, acknowledging reality rather than spinning comforting lies. "The facility has internal security too sophisticated to defeat twice. We get in, we gather evidence, we transmit it through Lisa's encrypted connections, and then we surrender or die depending on how they respond to discovery." Sarah absorbed this, nodded slowly, accepting what she'd probably already known. "I can live with that. If the evidence reaches the right people, if Granite and his network get exposed, then whatever happens to us is worth it." Lisa looked between them, professional detachment cracking to reveal the person underneath. "I'll make sure the evidence reaches people who can act. If you transmit it, I'll have copies distributed to journalists, congressional oversight committees, inspector generals at every involved agency. They won't be able to bury it." The promise carried weight beyond professional obligation, the kind of commitment that turned investigators into crusaders. Marcus understood the transformation, had seen it in himself years ago when he'd realized that following orders wasn't the same as doing what was right. They spent the day in final preparation, checking equipment repeatedly, rehearsing procedures until they became automatic, preparing for contingencies ranging from minor problems to catastrophic failures. By the time evening arrived, Marcus felt as ready as possible for an operation that would probably kill them. The drive to the abandoned lighthouse took 90 minutes, traveling back roads that saw more wildlife than vehicles, parking a mile away to approach on foot as darkness settled over the landscape. The lighthouse itself was a relic from an era when ships needed guidance through waters that killed carelessly, now just a monument to maritime history and bureaucratic neglect. The entrance to the maintenance tunnel was exactly where Danny's files indicated, concealed beneath what appeared to be a concrete foundation but actually covered a steel hatch, locked by mechanisms that required both physical key and electronic code. Lisa provided both credentials stolen from databases and reproduced with precision that suggested she'd done this before. The hatch opened onto darkness, and the smell of stagnant air metal ladder descending into spaces that hadn't seen regular use in decades. Marcus went first. Reaper secured in a tactical harness that would allow her to descend while maintaining 4 points of contact. Sarah followed, then Lisa, each of them carrying gear that made movement awkward but was essential for survival. The descent took 15 minutes. Ladder rungs slick with condensation and corrosion, darkness so complete that flashlights seemed to create more shadows than illumination. At the bottom, a horizontal tunnel extended in both directions. Concrete walls, weeping moisture floor puddled with water that had accumulated across years. Marcus oriented himself using the architectural plans memorized from Danny's files, choosing the passage that would lead toward Waypoint 7 while avoiding main security corridors. The walk was claustrophobic and disorienting tunnel barely 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, no landmarks except occasional junctions that matched the mental map he carried. Reaper moved ahead, nose working constantly, providing early warning if they approached occupied areas. Her behavior suggested the tunnels saw minimal traffic scent trails, old and faint, nothing indicating recent passage. But that would change as they neared the junction chamber, where meeting preparations would bring guards and participants into spaces usually left to darkness and memory. The first pressure door appeared 30 minutes into their infiltration, heavy steel designed to seal sections in case of breaches or attacks. It should have been locked, requiring credentials they didn't have, but stood open by perhaps 6 inches, suggesting someone had passed through recently without properly securing it behind them. Marcus approached carefully, listening for sounds beyond hearing only the mechanical hum of ventilation systems working to keep air circulating through the underground complex. He pulled the door wider, wincing at hinges that squeaked protest, then moved through with Reaper at his side. The tunnel beyond showed signs of regular maintenance walls, painted institutional green floor, cleaned recently enough to show no accumulation of dust. Overhead lighting provided illumination that eliminated need for flashlights, but also eliminated shadows for concealment. They were exposed now, visible to anyone who might be watching through cameras Marcus assumed were present but couldn't locate. Voices drifted from ahead, muffled by distance and intervening doors, but unmistakably human. Marcus gestured for the others to hold position while he advanced to the next junction. Reaper, silent at his side, moving with the controlled precision that made her invaluable in close quarters. The junction opened onto a staging area, lockers and benches suggesting security personnel used this space to change shifts and store equipment. 3 men in tactical gear sat talking, weapons within reach but not ready posture, suggesting they were early for shift change and killing time rather than actively patrolling. Marcus retreated, mind calculating options. They could try bypassing the staging area, but that required navigating unfamiliar passages with risk of getting lost or triggering security they hadn't anticipated. Or they could wait, hoping the guards would leave before the meeting started, gambling that time would provide opportunity. The decision was made for him when Reaper's ears swiveled tracking sound from behind them. Marcus turned to find a man emerging from a side passage, dressed in the same tactical gear as the guards ahead, carrying a weapon that came up instinctively at the sight of unexpected people. The fight was brief and brutal. Marcus closing distance before the guard could shout warning, hands finding throat and weapon, simultaneously applying pressure that cut off air and forced the gun aside. The guard struggled, training asserting itself, but Marcus had 20 years of close-quarters combat experience that translated to muscle memory faster than conscious thought. Reaper's intervention ended it, her teeth finding the guard's wrist, bearing down until bones cracked and the weapon fell free. The guard went limp, unconscious from lack of oxygen, dropping in a controlled fall that prevented noise from alerting others. They secured him with zip ties, gagged him with torn cloth, and dragged him into a maintenance alcove where he wouldn't be immediately visible. Lisa retrieved his weapon and credentials, passing the identification badge to Marcus with expression suggesting she understood the implications. "We just committed assault on federal property." Her voice was steady despite circumstances. "There's no walking this back. There never was." Marcus clipped the badge to his own gear, accepting that they'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The only direction left was forward into the facility toward evidence that might justify what they were becoming.